The heat was already oppressive when we received the orders to move. My squad crouched low, hidden among the dense trees as we peered out at the British defenses in the distance. From where we were positioned, I could see the British soldiers digging in, creating makeshift barricades and reinforcing their last defenses. They looked worn down, a mix of Indian, British, and Australian troops tired, desperate, with nowhere left to retreat. We'd been closing in on them for days, pushing them toward the southern tip of Singapore. There was nowhere left for them to go. The encirclement was complete. We had driven them south, through Malaya and across every river and bridge we could. Each advance had been swift, relentless, giving them little time to regroup. It was Yamashita's plan from the beginning: hit them hard, keep them moving, never let them settle. And now, here we were, with the city of Singapore laid out before us. Beside me, Sergeant Nakamura signaled for us to wait. He was a man of few words, his orders crisp and without hesitation. Under his command, we knew what was expected of us: precision, speed, and no sympathy for weakness. I'd been in his unit since the beginning of the Malayan campaign, and he had never led us astray. Now, he surveyed the terrain ahead, calculating our next move. The British and their allies had underestimated us, thinking we would be slow, that their fortifications in the sea would protect them. But we had crossed jungles, rivers, and steep mountains to reach this point, fighting through terrain they believed impassable. The confidence they'd held in Singapore's impenetrable defenses was shattered. I had to suppress a grim smile. They were trapped, but they didn't yet realize just how thoroughly. When the signal came, we moved silently through the trees, our rifles at the ready. The British artillery was firing sporadically from the city, but their aim was off. I could tell they were low on supplies and morale. They'd expected to be resupplied by sea, but our air force had cut off those routes. And the closer we got, the more obvious it became. They were hanging by a thread. As we closed in on their perimeter, I caught sight of a British soldier just a few yards away, huddled behind a sandbag wall. He was young, not much older than I was, his face pale under his helmet. His hands trembled as he clutched his rifle, his eyes scanning the jungle with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. In that moment, I almost felt a pang of something was at pity. I pushed it away. There was no room for such thoughts. This was war, and if I hesitated, I knew he wouldn't. Shots rang out as our squad opened fire, and the British position erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed through the trees, followed by the panicked movements of soldiers scrambling to reinforce their defenses. My training took over, each movement precise. My mind honed to a single point of focus: push forward, break their lines. The sound of footsteps behind me told me our reinforcements had arrived. Our men surged forward with fresh energy, tightening the noose even further. Each of us knew that this assault would be decisive. If we broke their line here, the city would be ours by nightfall. At one point, a British soldier stumbled out from behind a pile of rubble, raising his hands in surrender, his eyes wide with fear. He muttered something in English that I didn't understand, but the desperation in his voice was clear. Sergeant Nakamura didn't even pause. He ordered us to continue, leaving the soldier to the rear guard. There would be no mercy today, not when victory was within reach. We advanced through abandoned buildings and ruined barricades, pushing them back step by step. As we moved deeper into the city, the streets became littered with the remnants of what once had been a bustling British colony: discarded weapons, burnt-out vehicles, the smashed remains of buildings that had once been shops, homes, places of gathering. Now, it was a graveyard of hopes and defenses shattered by our relentless advance. By late afternoon, we had reached a central point near the command post. From here, we could see the British flag still flying, though it was tattered and frayed. Rumor had it that the British commander, General Percival, was considering surrender, though we hadn't received official word yet. The tension was thick as we held our positions, watching the city's defenders fall back and regroup, barely able to mount any serious resistance. As night fell, the city lay quiet, punctuated only by the occasional crack of distant gunfire. We had them surrounded, their lines broken and scattered. They had fought hard, but they hadn't been able to withstand our advance. For the first time since the campaign began, I felt a sense of inevitability settle over me. This city was ours. In the silence of that night, as I lay beneath the stars in a foreign land, I realized that the fall of Singapore would mark a turning point, not only for the war but for us. We had pushed ourselves to the edge, fighting with all we had, and now we stood on the brink of victory. And yet, beneath the pride and relief, there was a strange unease, a feeling I couldn't quite name, as though we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But that was a thought for another day. The morning of February 15th began with a heavy silence. I stood with my squad near what was left of the causeway, watching smoke rise from the city. Singapore had been merely reduced to ruins. The once grand British colony, with its broad avenues and bustling port, was a shell of its former self. And now, after weeks of relentless fighting, it was only a matter of time before they would have to surrender. We all knew it, even the British soldiers we had captured along the way. My commander, Sergeant Nakamura, gathered us to wait for orders. Rumors buzzed through our lines that the British command was considering surrendering, but nothing was certain yet. We had seen desperate resistance before in the last moments, and none of us were willing to relax until the final word came. Around noon, we received a message. General Percival, the British commander, had officially requested a meeting to discuss terms. I looked around at my fellow soldiers. For a moment, I saw surprise flicker in their faces, but it quickly turned to a hard, silent satisfaction. They were proud, and rightfully so. We had pushed the British to this point, against overwhelming odds, with fewer resources, fewer men, and the jungle itself against us. General Yamashita's tactics had worked exactly as planned. Speed, surprise, and sheer force had carried us all the way here. As we marched deeper into the city, we passed groups of British soldiers' faces grim, exhausted, some even relieved. Their rifles lay discarded at their feet, and the white flags of surrender fluttered on makeshift poles from the remaining buildings. Many of them couldn't meet our gaze, their eyes fixed on the ground, their shoulders slumped in silent defeat. We finally reached the meeting point at the Ford Motor Factory. As we stood outside, a hushed anticipation spread through our ranks. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions, pride in our achievement, but also a feeling I couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the weight of knowing what this surrender meant. We weren't just taking Singapore. We were breaking the very spirit of the British Empire in Asia. Inside, I heard murmurs of the discussion between Yamashita and Percival. Though I couldn't make out the words, the tone was clear, firm, unyielding. There would be no leniency, no concessions. The terms were simple total surrender. We had surrounded them, destroyed their defenses, and cut off every possible route of escape. They were at our mercy now. Eventually the doors opened, and we were told the decision was final. The British were surrendering. A strange silence settled over us. We had expected it, even fought tirelessly for this outcome. Yet now that it was here, none of us could quite comprehend the magnitude of what we had accomplished. The largest British-led force in history had just surrendered to us, to Japan. The Allied soldiers began filing past us, now prisoners of war under our watch. Their ranks stretched endlessly, thousands upon thousands Indian soldiers, Australians and British troops. Many of them were unsteady on their feet, weakened by days of constant bombardment, lack of food, and the emotional weight of their loss. As I stood there watching, I felt a flicker of something else, something closer to respect. Despite everything, they had fought hard, and it was only our unyielding speed and force that had overcome them. Sergeant Nakamura stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the endless line of prisoners. "Remember this," he said quietly, his gaze intense. "This is the price of victory, but it comes with responsibilities. We've won, but now we must carry what follows." I nodded, not fully understanding but recognizing the weight of his words. The victory was ours, but it was now clear to me that the days ahead would not be easy. We were responsible for these prisoners, responsible for this city, and as the prisoners continued to pass, their faces a mix of defeat, anger, and exhaustion, I felt the cost of this triumph settling onto my shoulders. That night, as I lay on the ground with my rifle beside me, I watched the fires still smoldering in the distance. The city was quiet now, but the smell of smoke and defeat lingered in the air. I thought of home, of the pride we'd feel when news of our victory reached Japan. But beneath that pride was something deeper, a nagging sense that this was only the beginning.